I'm Maya Parson in Leuven, Belgium. I'm here today for another episode of Talking Human Nature for the Human Nature Forum. My guest today is Dr. Tim Lewens, Professor of Philosophy in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge University. He is an expert in the philosophy of biology, biomedical ethics, philosophy of science, and he is the co-editor with Dr. Elizabeth Hannon of the 2018 edited volume, Why We Disagree About Human Nature. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Lewens.
It's a pleasure, Maya. Thanks for having me.
I've asked you here today to talk a bit about this book, and I'm wondering if you could tell us about the origins of this project and how you came to be involved.
Sure. I mean, the deep origins actually come from a really... I was struck by the ways in which different groups of scientists, different academics, really seem to disagree violently about the promise and the benefits of taking evolutionary approaches to understanding our own species, to understanding humans. And that was true even when the evolutionary scientists in question were very, very keen to stress the role of culture, for example, in shaping our species. So I was keen to try and kind of get to the bottom of some of those disagreements, try to understand why it was that these different factions couldn't get along with each other. And one of the subtopics that we approached at that stage was the very idea of human nature itself, which seemed to have some enthusiasts, some folk who thought that human nature was a bona fide topic for discussion and that the evolutionary sciences would be able to tell us what human nature is, and that would then be useful for various other projects, versus a whole bunch of other scientists, scholars in the humanities as well, who were skeptical even of the very idea of human nature, let alone specific claims about what human nature might be like. So that's the deep origins. We then convened a conference, tried to draw on a fairly broad range of different disciplines among our speakers. So we had people contribute from evolutionary biology, we had some anthropologists, we had philosophers, we had cognitive scientists. We got them together over a couple of days in a room, we got them to present their talks to each other. And the book is basically the product of that conference. So there are 10 different articles in 10 different chapters in that book written by different groups of people. And I think you see in part the origins of the individual contributions in a discussion as well, because I hope that something that comes out in the book is that although the disagreements were certainly not resolved, at least they had talked to each other and taken some account of each other's positions in the way that they then formulated their chapters. So I was pretty happy with how it turned out in the end.
So no fist fights.
No fist fights at all. Disagreement, but the sort of constructive, respectful disagreement that we like to see in seminar rooms, but no violence, thank goodness.
So if the study of human nature is rife with disagreement, as this volume indicates, what are the points of consensus, if there are any, that the contributors share, or was there a shared sort of jumping off point for this discussion, or was that just not even something that was apparent or on the table?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think there were some points of consensus. Most obviously, even among the enthusiasts for human nature, there was still agreement about what human nature is not. So by and large, I think everybody contributing to this volume agreed that you should not expect some kind of essence of Homo sapiens, right? That is to say, there are very good evolutionary biological reasons for denying that you're going to find some signature set of genes or maybe some signature set of behaviors or ways of thinking which are definitive of whether or not an individual is a member of Homo sapiens or not. And that rejection of what you might think of as very strongly essentialist views of human nature was shared. And one of the reasons why it was shared, I think, is because most people these days accept a view of what biological species are, which says basically that biological species are just little twigs on the tree of life. And what makes an individual organism, what makes you or me a member of the species Homo sapiens, is being part of the right twig, which in turn means that what makes us human is a matter of being part of this large evolutionary family. And just like in any family, the UK royal family, let's say, whether or not someone's a member of that family is not a matter of whether their nose is a certain shape, or whether their ears are a certain shape, or whether they've got particular ways of behaving. It's just a matter of who their parents are. And so I think there was a lot of consensus that you will not find what you might think of as a taxonomic nature. That is, some set of properties that make people human, and that if they lack them, they're not human. What makes you human is a matter of basically being part of the right evolutionary tree. So there was agreement about that. That is to say, there was agreement about how not to define human nature. However, beyond that, there wasn't all that much agreement at all, I would say. There were some people who would say that's not how to define human nature, and moreover, human nature is just not a respectable concept at all. We should do away with it. Other folk would say, oh, that's not the way to define human nature, but that doesn't mean that there aren't informative and useful things that we can say about what most humans are like, perhaps what most humans are like because of evolutionary processes that have affected our species. And that's enough for human nature. You don't need to go the whole essentialist hog, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. I'm wondering about the takeaway from this project for you in terms of your work. What did you learn from this, and how does it impact how you're thinking about your other research interests, or if you're still focused, in fact, on human nature? What kinds of productive ideas have come out of these disagreements for you, or these tensions?
Yeah, I mean, I always find it useful to, have the most thoughtful, reflective people present their views on these things. Partly because I am absolutely still thinking about these topics, and I think one of the things that I've taken away from that discussion, and which I've been thinking about quite a lot just over the past year or so, is human nature is a concept with several faces. So on the one hand, it's very easy to think, what could be wrong with the idea of human nature? What could possibly be wrong with the simple idea that there are some general truths that it would be useful to articulate about what most humans by and large are like? Surely there are some general truths about what most humans by and large are like, and wouldn't it be really useful to know them? And isn't it a really valuable goal for the sciences to then try to delineate those? Because that kind of knowledge could be useful for all sorts of things. It could be useful for medicine. It could be useful for social policy. It looks as though this could be a very valuable repository of information. So on the one hand, you can get yourself into a place where you think, this idea sounds not only totally unobjectionable, but also really rather valuable. But at the same time, there are all sorts of worries that you can also generate for yourself, even about these fairly modest sounding proposals for what we mean when we talk about human nature. One example is, on the face of it, talking about human nature isn't just talking about what most humans are like. it's also a way of talking about what we owe to nature rather than what we owe to culture.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, things start to get a lot more problematic, I think, because the very idea that you can draw a line between nature and culture is, I think, something that's coming under a lot of pressure. Maybe another less contentious way of putting that is that some scientists, and I'm thinking most notably of people like Cecilia Hayes at Oxford, have tried to suggest that what we learn from each other doesn't just influence very local patterns of variability, such as the fact that people in Belgium, where you are, like to drink delicious beer, and people in Bordeaux, where I am, like to drink delicious red wine. Learning from others doesn't just generate and stabilize these very local patterns. Hayes thinks that learning from others also helps to generate and stabilize very important traits that characterize our species as a whole. So she thinks all sorts of very distinctive things about how humans are able to understand what others are thinking, how they're able to emulate the actions of others. She thinks many of these traits are also generated and stabilized by processes of learning from others, albeit processes that are spread across the whole species. So if you take that kind of view, you might worry about the idea of human nature if it carries with it an implication that the ways we are generally must also be the ways we are that owe themselves to nature as opposed to culture. I think there are also worries that come from the thought that, okay, maybe what human nature really tells us about is some of the features of our species, which are particularly sticky, if you like, particularly kind of hard to shift. Maybe there are some ways that humans are generally, and those are the ones we have to, so to speak, work with rather than struggle against. What continues to worry me about that proposal is that there are so many different reasons why traits might be sticky. So it might be that this is because they're very, very robust to different environments. Change the environment however you like, they're going to develop in the same way. It might also be because humans are very good at maintaining their environments and keeping the environment stable. So that actually you could change the environment and you could change the trait. It's just that we don't like to do that, because one of the things humans are very, very good at doing is constructing environments. They're very good at constructing places to live. They're very good at constructing sources of nutrition, for example. And of course, another reason why it might be that traits are very, very sticky is because entrenched political systems have a lot of inertia behind them. And if only they were to shift, then maybe all sorts of other developmental possibilities would be open to us. It's just that nobody's bothered to do that yet. So one of the things I've taken away from these discussions, from the very discussion of difference between thinkers about human nature, is that there's a kind of tension in the way in which sometimes conceptions of human nature can seem totally innocuous, very, very valuable. Other ways in which conceptions of human nature, although on the face of it totally innocuous and valuable, can kind of hide, I think, some worries, either scientific worries or practical worries. And I guess I'd say I'm kind of continuing to try and think through some of those issues.
My guest today has been Dr. Tim Lewens, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge, co-editor with Elizabeth Hannon of Why We Disagree About Human Nature. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Talking Human Nature.